Hi everyone, I'm Jillian. I'm a learning advisor with Academic Skills, and this is our session on thesis structures for HDR students who are doing theses in humanities or social science. So let's get into it. You want to be thinking about the type of thesis you are producing. It is more common for humanities and social science HDR students to complete a traditional thesis, which means it's about 80 to 100,000 words of integrated chapters that have a kind of narrative and flow. When we talk about thesis by publication or by compilation, that has to do with students who have already organized with their supervisor that they will be writing journal articles as their chapters. And that might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 journal articles that they plan to write and get published or be in the pipeline for publishing or submitting for publication. It all depends on your school in terms of the number of publications you would need to have, and those, it would be okay to just be on submission still. But presuming that many of you who will be listening to this, who are HAS students, would be doing the traditional thesis, and less likely that you'd be doing the thesis by publication because that's more for science students or engineering students. So if you are doing it by publication and you're a humanities student, you might want to check out the video that is Thesis Structures STEM for the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics students. So thinking about as well, what makes a thesis effective? What are your examiners looking for? And how can you meet those requirements? You have that kind of idea in the back of your mind probably of what you think makes an effective thesis and what you think examiners are looking for. So try to bring that to the forefront and think about, how, examine those what you think of in terms of what the examiners are looking for and what makes thesis effective. And, we'll discuss how you can meet those requirements. But what we think of as what examiners are looking for and what makes a thesis effective or good in the following, all of these. And this is what has been found in some not very recent research, as you can see here from 2002, but we don't believe that this has changed very much over the past a couple of decades. It's still the case that this is the way examiners feel, and they haven't done an update to this study. So this was a study where they interviewed quite a number of PhD examiners and came up with this list, and you can go ahead and read the entire article about what examiners are looking for. And so you can see from that title, it's a PhD, not a Nobel Prize. And the main idea here is that a lot of students hold on to their PhD for a really long time with that idea in mind, like it's got to be absolutely perfect. It's got to be Nobel Prize worthy research. And it's not. It's a PhD thesis. It's a kind of genre that altogether you'll never write again quite in this way. It's its own thing, and it will never be repeated unless you do another PhD in a different discipline. From now on, if you continue with academia, you'll be writing journal articles and books, and they will have different structures. They won't be as long as the thesis, and they won't be quite as comprehensive. So, their argument in this paper is really that it's good to submit your PhD, and that it doesn't need to be, in your mind, 100% perfect, because it's very rare that any student would actually not pass, that they would fail the examiner's report. It is very often that PhDs will do fine with the examiners and have some minor revisions. That's the most common outcome by far. So at any rate, the characteristics of a good thesis that were found from these interviews is that it's original, right? That's what we know all along. That's when you submit your proposal, when you submit to just do your PhD, you're always proving that you're going to make an original contribution to research, to your discipline or subdiscipline or whatever it is. So, in a broad sense, think about that again and some more as to how you're going to show throughout your thesis how it's original work, and it makes a genuine contribution. Coherence, so that has to do with the links between the chapters, that it's easy to follow, that the argument builds, that you're telling a kind of narrative that supports an overall thesis, that it's well structured, that it's all progressing logically. From the chapter progression is more at the level we'll be discussing in this video, but of course also within chapters, within your sections, within your paragraphs, that things are progressing logically and clearly, that there's a clear communication of that high standard to be published. Not necessarily that you will get it published. It would take, it takes quite a bit of work to convert your thesis into a book publishable standard, because it's just a different genre to write an academic book versus a thesis. So it does take some rewriting, as well as if you wanted to turn your chapters into journal articles, that takes a bit of rewriting as well, because your chapters are much longer than a journal article would be. But of that standard to be published, of that high standard, basically. Okay, so the main thing to keep in mind, and to have that coherence, to have that well-structured argument, to have that clear communication, to have that standard to be published, is that your thesis needs a thesis. It needs a main argument. It needs that key message you want to get across, whatever you want to call it. It needs that central point that you can sum up in a sentence or two, what that main argument is for your research. And it's the answer. You've put together some central research questions. That's very common in humanities and social sciences, to form your central research questions from your thesis proposal review. That's going to be in your introduction chapter as well. So you've come to these questions. You've worked hard on coming to these original questions that pose a question where the answer will be, that unique contribution to your discipline. And it's the driving force behind your inquiry. So the answer to it is going to be your overall argument. And that's what your whole thesis will be hung upon. And that's what you're going to be working on within your chapters to support your answer to your central research question by evidence, and to be persuasive as well. So you can think of them as central research questions, and that's, like I was saying, very common in humanities and social sciences, but it might also be the case instead that you have aims instead of a research question. That's fine too. That works. If it's aims, then you are thinking about how you fulfilled your aims, and then that would be the driving force. So it is more common for you guys to have questions, but it might be the case that you frame them as aims. Okay, so another way of thinking about what your examiners are expecting, what your general readers of your thesis are expecting, is to think about the difference between these two terms here, writer responsible and reader responsible. So I bolded writer responsible because that is the one we all are as writers in English in academic culture that we are in. That is the expectation, that we will be writer responsible. We are responsible as writers for making everything very smooth and clear for our readers. The reader is not responsible for making meaning of our work. We as writers are totally responsible to make the reading experience very comfortable, as easy as we can. It is very complicated material, but we want to make our argument and our evidence and our interpretation of that evidence and how it connects to our argument as explicit and clear as possible, right? We don't want to leave it up to inference and implication, because then we're asking the reader to be responsible. We're asking them to do some of the work for us. And that happens sometimes in different genres of writing. Just not in this one, in academic writing. You can probably remember maybe classes in high school or something like that where you read poetry. That's reader responsible, right? It's up to the reader to make meaning out of those metaphors and the blank space, and to interpret what the poet author is saying, similar with other types of creative writing and short stories, and similar to other types of languages. Other languages in academia are also more reader responsible. And it just so happens that the English language academic culture is writer responsible. Those are the expectations. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying this is where we're at. And this is what your examiners are expecting and your readers throughout your academic career are expecting. Okay, so it's your responsibility to ensure your reader understands your thesis. It's not like maybe more in creatively we could say, well, they just didn't get it. They just don't like my style, my tone, the story I'm telling. But this is academic writing. And so you've got to be convincing. You've got to be as explicit as possible to make sure your reader gets it, understands it, is clear on what you're trying to say, and is convinced that it is a genuine original contribution. So you've got to make sure your argument is clear up front. It's going to be in your abstract. It's going to be in your introduction. You're going to be reinforcing the reader with your understanding of the argument throughout your chapters by developing, contextualizing as you go within all of your chapters. So it's always persuasive. It's not a genre where you are just explaining something, where you are just showing us all that you know about a topic. It's about how you've answered that research question and how you're going to convince us that you've answered it well, or that you've met your aims, you've fulfilled your aims and you've fulfilled them well. And by doing so, you have something new to tell us. Okay, so it's not just saying, I know all this stuff about what other people have found. It's about the new thing you have to tell us, and how what other people have found bolsters your own findings. But your findings, the new thing, is the star of the show here. So just to think a little bit more deeply about writer responsible versus reader responsible. So that's the English academic reader expectations there. That is being writer responsible, what we are. So what do our readers of our academic writing want? They want specific, detailed, precise language. They want to not fill in the gaps. Even if it seems really obvious, we don't, as readers of English academia, we don't feel comfortable filling in the gaps, the implications, the inferences. We're uncomfortable with vague or ambiguous language. We're not sure exactly what it means. We might be reading inaccurately, and it makes us do some work. We have to make those inferences then. We have to fill in the gaps, and we don't like to do that. And what is meant is what is said. Whereas in reader responsible writing in other academic cultures that might be, writing in other languages, those readers are comfortable with less direct communication. They will fill in the gaps. They will figure out and their understanding of vague or ambiguous language, and they will, deal with metaphor and context cues and those implications and inferences in a way that, English academic readers just won't feel comfortable doing. So we've got to, that is often a good way for students to really understand why they have to be explicit, and why we as learning advisors, or why their supervisors keep telling them to be more upfront about your argument, because that's what the expectation is in our culture here. Okay, so thesis writing is like this, back to basics. This is something we also tell, undergrads writing essays. It's all the same with academic writing, in that we want to know your argument at the beginning, and we want to be reminded all the way through, and then we want you to remind us at the end. And we see how that's being writer responsible. You're telling us, this is what I'm arguing, and you are then reinforcing that throughout, making that experience for us readers much easier, right? Rather than having us try to figure it out like we're reading a mystery novel, which makes us have to think and, is it this, is it that? And that's fun if we are reading a mystery novel, but it's not fun if we're doing academic reading, where everything is so complicated anyway. We want to really understand what your purpose is, what you found, and then we want to understand the story of how you found it. But we want to know upfront how you found, like what you found, first of all, how you found it, and then how you support those findings, how you interpret those findings, how you frame the significance of those findings. We want to know all of that throughout the text, and to be reminded in the conclusion as well. So it's something to think about, and maybe pause the video now and write down what your argument is, what your key message is for your thesis. It's important to know that before you go on to thinking about what your bigger structure is going to be. And so we can't really have a structure without having our argument. Those two things are really intertwined and support each other. So make sure you're clear on, get out your research question and then, well, what is my overall answer? If you're at that stage of being able to do that, you might have several research questions. And in that case, I suggest, thinking about the scope of those questions. Your questions, I've read quite a few research questions where the student author has maybe 3 or 4 questions, and some are at a really small scope and some are at a really big scope, but they're listed as if they are the same. So you want to think about perhaps having, 2 questions that are at the same level of scope. Maybe that's the case for you, or maybe you just have one overarching question. And then you've got some sub questions that are smaller that fit underneath that overarching question. So you want to revisit your questions if you have more than one to really figure out their scope and their level, so that you can be the one at the highest level. That would be your argument for your whole thesis. It would be your answer at the highest level of that one question, or maybe it's 2. I think I did have 2 overall questions in my thesis, and maybe no sub questions, or maybe some, I can't remember. But it's important to differentiate in that case. If you have some questions that are smaller in scope, you've got to make that clear. Otherwise, if you're trying to answer 4 or 5 questions and some are really big and some are really small, but you've put them all at the same level and that's what you're trying to address in your thesis argument, that's going to be too much to handle. So you've got to differentiate. What are your one main or 2 main questions? And maybe what are those sub questions? Don't worry about those sub questions for your thesis answer. You're going to be addressing those bigger 1 question or 2 questions as your thesis answer, and those sub questions will be answered within your chapters as well. Okay, so your thesis is all about developing each chapter in relation to your argument. And that will ensure development of a coherent point of view. If you think this is my argument, then you're going to think about how you can structure each chapter in relation to supporting that argument. Okay, so just to show you this in a more visual way about how argument is king here and is at the top level, and only once you have that can you have a structure that supports your argument, can you have paragraphs that support your structure and argument, can you have expression that supports all the way up again. So we've got to have this kind of macro to micro approach and think about how the micro feeds back up into our macro purpose. So this works as well when you're editing. You can't just edit your expression and forget about the top 3 layers. Changing a few words or sentences around isn't going to do much if your argument is not clear, right? So we've got to get our priorities straight. And a great way to do that is by doing the exercise that's coming up called the thesis argument map, and really just thinking about your thesis structure is going to help you, get to composing those paragraphs and composing those sentences and revising those word choices. But that can only come once we've got the argument and the structure carefully squared away. Okay, so we don't want it to be a kind of maze for our reader. We want it to be a really clear, smooth reading experience. So let's think about how to do that and what is going to make a good structure and what are some common structures for your HASS style theses. Okay, so you're thinking about, this is general for HASS, and you want to think about what are your disciplinary conventions. I'm telling you kind of what's general for HASS. That's very big, all of humanities and all social sciences. You might have something more specific happening with your particular discipline, subdiscipline, school. But in any case, you want to be signposting to help the reader follow along. And that has to do with, you can do that in a lot of places. At the end of the introduction chapter, you're going to have your chapter outline. And that's where you're going to say, chapter 1 shows, chapter 2 argues. Throughout chapter 3, demonstrate. You want to have those kinds of verbs to really help you to focus in on what your argument is for each chapter, what the key purpose is. And you're going to be signposting all along in the beginnings of your chapters. You're going to signpost what's coming up in the body of that chapter. You're going to signpost your reasons, signpost your analysis, not just like forecasting the future. This chapter will explore, will explain, and you're not really telling us, so we'll investigate, but you're not telling us the fruit of that investigation. Like, you want to be really upfront about what the chapter is arguing, what the key message is, and not just say, I'm putting it off until later and you're going to have to pick it out as I go on and explain various aspects of this topic. Okay, so there's many ways to signpost within and throughout your thesis. You want to be signposting between chapters, as chapter 2 showed this, moving on from chapter 3 argues this. And then maybe, signposting at the ends of chapters as well. As you conclude, this chapter has shown this, that it follows logically to look at this next in chapter 4, and then pick that up again. Even between sections in your chapters, you might be signposting, summarizing the end of that one section, and then starting the new section. As we saw in the previous section, this happened, and following on from that, now we see this, and we turn to this argument, this next piece of my argument, my next point, my next reason. Make sure you're really, that's being really explicit, again, being really upfront, helping the reader, being writer responsible, and helping the reader follow along really carefully and feel like we're in good hands here. We're with someone who is taking us by the hand and leading us through this very complex research project, so we can really grasp it clearly and understand it and be on the writer's side and feel like they're on our side and they want us to understand. And they're really open, and not like it often seems like when writers write really in a really complex way and they kind of obfuscate their meaning, it seems like they're insecure about what they're trying to say, and they want to just kind of dress it up with some complicated language instead of just being really direct about what they found and why it's significant. Okay, so basic thesis structure. Where are you with this? I have it stated in a couple of different ways, depending on how you think about it. But the basic thing is you're going to have an introduction chapter telling us about the bit of the context of the topic, the problem, the issue, the debate, whether or not it's very contentious, whether or not it's a really big problem. It might be more of an issue for you guys, a gap, but also what is this issue here? What is the perhaps a disagreement around this particular topic you've chosen that leads into the research questions or aims, that leads into the chapter outline. And then you've got your lit review, where you're always arguing that your research builds on the work of others and fills an important gap. So it's not just that no one has studied this before, so you have to do it. It's that no one's done it before, and it's important to do this work, and that it builds on the work of others, but it's still original. You've got to always be carving that out, particularly in the lit review. Then that can lead on to the methods. So you can think about the literature review really convincing us of the importance of your research question, and the methods as justifying what you did to answer those research questions, how you gathered your data and how you did that, and you made the best choice in terms of all the methods that were open to you. You made the best choice in choosing the methods that would answer the research question. And that has to do with how you framed the research question. If you framed the research question in such a way as to have us think, well, a survey would be the best way to answer that, but you went and did field research and interviewed people, you want to think about that research question perhaps. How can that be framed much more clearly as to lead to qualitative, an expectation of qualitative data gathering. Okay, so with your methods chapter, you want to start with that framing of your theoretical point of view, depending on what that is. Like, it's all going to be constructivist, right? We're not scientists. We're not doing objectivist epistemology, where what we believe that what we see and observe is the truth. We know that in humanities and social science that our knowledge is constructed, right? So I think that's pretty much a given. But then from there, what is your epistemology? epistemology that goes one level in from that constructivist viewpoint. Mine was feminist post-structural theory, so I could start from there and then narrow in on why that was my theoretical lens, and then I could get into the nitty-gritty of my method. So for me, I thought of that, I think, and I would have, I'm sure there's different terminologies, but I go by the terminology that's my methodology, like my theory, and then my method is what I did. And they all link up together. And so then my method was doing interviews, doing participant observation, and doing a discourse analysis. And I call that a triangulation of my research methods, which is a fancy way of saying I did three things. And then I've got my data chapters. I had about 5 data chapters, I believe. And then a conclusion chapter. You can think of it in a different way. You can think of it as data chapter. You might call it an empirical chapter. They might be, if you're doing it by compilation, by publication, they might be your papers. They might be case studies. You might call them themes. Whatever you call them, they're the meat of your thesis. They are where you're really analyzing and making arguments from your data. So that's where I broke up my thesis. I'll show you kind of what I did. I had 5 thematic chapters. So how did I break up those themes, right? Based on my data collection, I decided upon 5 big themes that all fed into my overall argument, right? And so with each of my themes, or whatever you want to call it, it all added up to my overall big argument around my field research data and the answer to my research questions. For me, I had 2 lit review chapters. That's an option. It's not very traditional, but totally possible, in that my research was set in the Arabian Gulf. So my supervisor suggested that I have one shorter lit review chapter situated in the context of the Arabian Gulf and Arabian Gulf studies, and then having the more theoretical lit review chapter around post-structural feminism and other research that's been done with that lens in Middle Eastern contexts, as well as globalization, gender and nationalism, the idea of modernity and tradition and colonialism and Orientalism, like all of that theoretical ideas were then added into that second chapter. And my argument there was that these were the most important theoretical concerns for my research questions. And that's how I framed it, as an argument. And then I called my methods my research process and methods, or you could call it research design and methodology, either one. And then I had those 5 thematic data chapters and a conclusion chapter. My intro and conclusion were only about 1,500 words, I believe. They don't need to be very long. You want to think about your word count. You want to think about, how you're going, what are you aiming for? It could be just 80, 100 is quite a lot. And for anyone doing thesis by publication, it's not 80 to 100. It would be shorter than that. But if we're doing a traditional thesis, probably it is 80 to 100. For me, where I did my PhD, 80 was the max. So to my mind, that's a good word count, but you can go that as well as you see fit, but you want to think about those word counts so you're not like, totally overblowing it. I've seen many students who could go well over 100,000 words, but we don't need to, then things are going to get really loose and clunky and not as focused. So you want to think about each chapter, each of your data chapters being about 10,000 words. Your methods might be around that as well, and your lit review might be around that as well. When things get over 10,000, I think when chapters get over 10,000, I think they get a bit clunky. So you want to be careful of that, but the intro and conclusion doesn't need to go on and on and on, unless you've, collapsed together your intro and lit review into one chapter. That is possible. And in that case, that will be longer. Okay. And then if you were ever, if you were doing a more, like if maybe you were in political science and did some quantitative research, you might have your chapters set up like this. This is more when you do kind of quantitative research, which is more in the sciences and in the other fields outside of humanities and social sciences typically, that you would see the IMRAD approach, intro, methods, results, discussion, with the lit review plunked in there as well. And if that's you, you might want to check out our thesis structures for STEM subjects, because it will go more into depth on what that looks like. Okay, so there are we suggest that you look at some sample abstracts, some sample table of contents to get a sense of how other people are setting this out. There are some that are table of contents that are very spare, and there are some that are really intricate in terms of the chapter title, the chapter sections, subsections. I had mine more like that, a bit more intricate in terms of chapter titles, big sections, and then indented more into subsections. That's what I wanted to do. But there are other examples where it's quite spare and they just have maybe, just a few chapters, but they don't go into their subsections, and maybe they don't have sections and subsections. They just have their chapters without those differentiations. But you want to compare them and think about what best, what do you like the best? What do you think, instinctually fits what you're doing, how your argument is going to be developed. You want to read abstracts as well. You want to, practice writing your own abstract as early as possible. That will help you to really understand the big picture and grasp the big picture of what you're arguing. You will be saying in your abstract what you have found, what your main argument is and why it's significant. And that will help you to set up the rest of your thesis, the rest of your chapters, and to ensure that those chapters and those chapter arguments connect clearly to and directly address and support the answer, that argument that you state as your overall answer within the thesis. So we have a tool called the argument map that I mentioned before. It's a really good tool to clarify the focus of your argument, help you see the bigger picture at a glance. You can just see, this is what my thesis is going to be. You can make revisions, but it's good to kind of just see it at a glance instead of like scrolling through 500 pages of a Word document. It helps you to see how your chapters are aligned with your overall argument. It can keep you on track with the word limit. And it's great to show people, show your supervisors, show us, learning advisors, and we can have a chat about what we think of the alignment. That's really fun to do. So this is what it looks like. It's not that complicated, but it does really help you to see, as you can tell, your whole argument at a glance. Let's just see. Okay, so we do have on our website, if you just Google ANU Academic Skills Thesis Structure, you will see various options, and you will see like a long thesis map, and that would be, give you more than 4 chapters. It would go up to, I think, 7 or 8. So you can download that one as a Word doc and start filling that in. But as you can see, it has your research question. What is your main research question or aim? What is your argument? You always keep that at the top, and you always look at that and think about that as you fill in your chapter arguments. How did they link up? And as you fill in each section's argument, how does that link up with the argument of that chapter? It also gives you the ideas for the moves of your introduction that you could follow that generally tend to work well in a smooth, coherent way if you followed those moves, as well as some moves for your conclusion. So on our website as well, you can see some examples of how those were filled out in various ways. And think about filling it out yourself and showing it to us at Learning at Academic Skills, seeing a learning advisor, and we can help you fill out more, or just be a check-in point to make sure you filled it out in a way that is really helpful to you. If you just fill it out in a way that says, oh yeah, with just topics, and says, oh, this section will argue about, the effects of World War II, that's not going to help you. So you want to make the document a helpful document to you. You want to fill it out as fully as you can, thinking about what your overall argument is and what your chapter arguments are and how you might support those chapter arguments in your sections. That's the only way it's going to be helpful. You certainly do this exercise in a helpful way. If you just want to, take a box and say, oh, I filled this out, but it didn't really help me, you've got to actually use the tool appropriately. Okay. So you want to be thinking about your work as this unified whole, especially if you're writing a traditional thesis, but even if you're writing it by publication, it does all have to add up to this whole where you're supporting your overall argument, your overall findings. So it's not just these separate sections and chapters, they link together. And so how will that best be ordered? How will that best be linked, especially in your data chapters? You're going to have your lit review and your methods, and then you're going to have your data chapters, thematic chapters, whatever you want to call them. But what is the best order of those chapters? Is it linear? Is it, building in some kind of way? Perhaps, there are various themes, and maybe you want to go from the most convincing to the kind of least convincing, or the largest in scope to the kind of more niche in scope. It all depends. But you want to reference back and forth across chapters, obviously not overdoing it, but, as we saw in this chapter, this building upon that is now this, to create that continuity. Okay, so we suggest you think about, reading some example thesis maps, creating your own, but thinking about how well the argument answers the research question, how well the structure supports the argument. If you read a couple, how do they compare? So we suggest you fill out your own argument map. It's easy to find, and if you just Google Thesis Structures, ANU, it will be right there as a reference document. And then think about how can you thread your argument throughout your chapters? How can you show those links? Okay, so then once you've got that settled, you can start planning your chapters. Obviously, you can plan your chapters throughout, but you can start to really step back and take a macro look. Sometimes we just need to write into things before we can really figure out what we want to say, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's got to all be perfect before you can start writing, but it's got to be that back and forth flow where you do take a step back to look at the macro to make sure you've got what you want there. It is a focused document in the that you're working towards a much more focused draft than where you're writing towards understanding. That's a bit more like free writing. That isn't something you write for someone else. That's something you write for yourself. And then from that, once you've written to understand what you want to say, what you want to argue, then you can bring that to, this is my draft for other people to read, where I am being explicit and upfront about my argument and I'm supporting it clearly. Okay, so, we read a lot of chapters that when HDR students send us their chapters that are very descriptive. So you want to make sure you're making your argument. Even if you said it in the intro, remember, we need that all along, us readers of English academic writing. So you've got to keep telling us what is your argument for this chapter? What is the point of this chapter? Is it just to tell me stuff about this aspect of World War I? Or what are you arguing about this historical event and its impact? What new idea are you bringing to this? We don't just want to read about how you've understood the documents, literature within this field. We want to know how you've built upon them. Okay. And so we want to know the purpose and argument of each chapter. So that's going to be up front. That's going to be in the beginning. You're going to tell us the purpose of your chapter, the argument of your chapter, how it's going to be clear, reading those first couple paragraphs of each chapter, how this argument of this chapter fits in with the overall thesis. If it's really unclear for you how this chapter contributes to the argument of a thesis as a whole, you might question that chapter. I had to cut a chapter from my thesis. Well, I didn't have to, but my supervisors recommended it, and I agreed. I thought, yeah, this isn't really fitting. It's not really working. My other chapters are so much stronger. I kept trying to work at it and make it fit and make it better and stronger. And I didn't need to. I could just cut it out. I had enough material. And then that made the whole thing stand so much stronger than having this weak link chapter that didn't really contribute to my argument in the end. I thought it would, obviously, but I realized it didn't, and so I can cut it. Okay, just an example from a introduction where the author Gould has done their chapter outline. And so we can just see this example of how they gave a snapshot, signposting of their chapter 2. In chapter 2, I turned to the idea of development in greater detail. Okay, so telling us what she's doing, turning to this new idea that's helpful as we're transitioning for something else to, turning to this idea in greater detail. I argue that participatory approaches are relevant. After considering these issues, I turn to the literature, using that I to tell us what she's doing, what he or she is doing, what they are doing, the moves they are making. Finally, I compare. A central theme is this, really just being explicit and upfront about the moves they're making, the arguments they're making, the details, the points, the reasons that they're using as support. And then framing it further in that last sentence. This is a theme which dominates the following 4 chapters, which are otherwise ethnographic in their focus. So really just framing what's to come in a big sense, how the chapters are grouped together following this one. So that's a good example. See what other examples you can find in your discipline as for chapter outlines and how they go over what's going to happen in the chapter outlines, and find ones that you really like, that resonate with you. You might read a few that you think, I don't really like this. This isn't clear. It's not making the argument very clear. You don't have to follow those then. Follow the ones that you think are really written well. That's cool. It might be more helpful to look at the chapter structure with this graphic in terms of starting broad, background, context, issue, debate. This is always what an introduction is in most academic writing across undergrad to your HDR thesis writing. So starting broad, narrowing in on your line of argument, and you might have, it makes sense to have 3, 4, 5 big sections for your 10,000 word chapters, and then thinking about those sections. How do I break down the paragraphs of those sections to support my key message of each section? So all this will become more apparent as you write into it more, but as you become more and more willing to take that step back and say, what is my argument here? How well am I proving it? How explicit am I being in supporting what I'm trying to say here and supporting my overall thesis? And then that conclusion, restating, linking to next chapter, broadening out again. Okay, so that's all I have to tell you about thesis structures for HATS, and we would love to see you as I've suggested. So come book in with a learning advisor. It's easy to book an appointment. You can just Google ANU Academic Skills Appointments and the link will pop up, and then you would book in with a learning advisor. That's what HDR students should be doing, and we would love to see you. So I hope that was helpful, and best of luck with your thesis structures.